If you're working in the United States under TN status or on a TN visa, you might wonder whether or not you can change your employers or you can add an additional employer and what that process looks like. And the answer is yes to both. You can change your employers and you can have multiple employers at the same time. The important thing to understand here is your TN, once it's approved, is only valid for the position you were approved for that employer. So if you do choose to change your employers or add another employer and work for multiple employers in the US at the same time, you need to receive prior approval before commencing work. You cannot use that current TN that you were admitted on to work for a different employer or under a different profession than which you were approved for. Now, this process varies a little bit depending on what country you are a citizen of. So first, we're going to cover the rules for a Canadian. So if you are a Canadian citizen and you are in the United States and currently under TN status, and you want to change employers or you want to add an additional employer and work for multiple employers in the United States, the process is the same. You can follow the same process that you did typically in the beginning to obtain a TN visa by applying at a U.S. port of entry or through pre-flight inspection. Now, what does that look like? Well, you would simply depart the United States. Then you would carry with you the proper paperwork for your new employer. You would carry with that with you to a port of entry or pre-flight inspection point, and then you would simply tell the border officer that you are changing employers, and then they would adjudicate your application right there at the border and then admit you and approve you for work for that new employer. Now, if you're adding an employer, it's the same process. You would depart the United States, carry the additional paperwork for the new employment into the United States, and you would tell the officer at the port of entry that you are adding an employer, that you want to work for both at the same time, and they will go through the same process. Now, multiple employers is most common with consultants, but it also is common with other individuals. Maybe you're in the computer field and you have a full-time employer and you want to add a part-time employer. So if you're Canadian, it can be simply done at a port of entry with the proper paperwork. Also, if you are Canadian and you don't want to leave the United States, you can also have your new employer file by mail with USCIS for you to change employers or to add them as a concurrent employer to authorize you to work for them in the United States. That process is a little bit different. It requires more effort on the part of the employer, as they're going to have to sign additional forms that are not required at a port of entry. And a lot of employers are a little more hesitant to do the mail-in process because it does require more paperwork. It's also a lot more expensive because you have to pay USCIS filing fees, and it's also a lot slower because you have to wait for USCIS approval before you can start employment. Whereas if you depart the United States at a port of entry, it's simply departing and re-entering, which is a very quick process at the border. You're only paying the $56 border processing fee, and you can start immediately upon re-entry and approval on that TN. Whereas with USCIS, even if you pay the exorbitant premium processing fee, you're looking at, typically we tell people 1 to 2 months at the earliest before you can start employment for that new employer through either changing or adding an employer by mail with USCIS. So typically most Canadians, unless they have some reason that they can't travel out to outside of the United States, are going to take advantage of the border or pre-flight inspection processing because it's much quicker and it's much cheaper. Now, if you're Canadian or if you're Mexican, the process, you are limited in your options. Typically, a Mexican will be using the USCIS process to change or add an employer, and that's done the same way as a Canadian would. The employer would actually have to file the paperwork for you in the United States, and then upon approval, then you could commence working for them in the United States. Now, in either of these processes, it's important to understand that you cannot commence employment until either approval by the border or through approval by USCIS. Now, there is a little bit of a nuanced process for a Mexican citizen where they can, if they have a valid visa in their passport, attempt to change or add in employers at a port of entry. That process is a little bit more nuanced, and not all ports of entry accept border processing by Mexican citizens. So if you are a Mexican and you want to try the border process, make sure you're adequately prepared with the proper language in your application that indicates to that border officer what you are doing, so that they know the law and that they're able to either change or add your employer at the port of entry. The safest bet for a Mexican citizen, however, is by mail with USCIS, because CBP is all over the place in border processing for TNs for Mexican citizens. So whether you're Canadian or a Mexican citizen and you want to change or add in employers, you can do that. You can change your employers by either method, USCIS or with CBP or pre-flight inspection. But again, remember, you cannot commence employment for that new employer, or you cannot add that new employer and commence employment for that concurrent employment until you have been approved to do so. So make sure you maintain your status in the United States, that you're only working for an authorized employer, and you don't commence new employment until you've been given authorization to do so either by USCIS or by CBP.